October 14, 1943, 25,000 feet above Germany. The sky burns with tracer fire. The air stinks of oil, cordite, and frozen fear. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, 22 years old, kneels in the coffin-sized tail of his B-17 Flying Fortress, gripping twin .50 caliber Brownings. Frost creeps across the plexiglass. His oxygen mask crackles with each shallow breath. Below, a Focke-Wulf 190 rises from the clouds, the Predator's preferred angle. 6 o'clock, low. Romano tracks it through the primitive ring and bead sight, a circle of metal and hope. He fires. The tracers arc wide. The German shells tear through the tail like claws through paper. He survives. Many don't. Across Germany that day, 60 bombers fall, 600 men die, and hundreds more limp home on fire. At High Wycombe headquarters, generals demand answers. Their flying fortress bleeds faster than it can be built. But in the cold dark of Bassingbourn airfield, one exhausted gunner, grease-stained hands, notebook open on his knee, begins sketching an idea the engineers call impossible. A mirror that will triple tailgun accuracy and defy the rulebook of war. By the summer of 1943, the Allied war in the air had reached its breaking point. The U.S. 8th Air Force was carrying the burden of daylight precision bombing. A campaign built on faith that technology and courage could defeat geography, weather, and the Luftwaffe. Every morning, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses climbed into the thin, freezing air above England, bound for targets deep in Germany. Regensburg, Bremen, Schweinfurt, Münster. They called it the Aluminum Trail, a shimmering ribbon of vapor and metal stretching east, marking the path to death. The strategy was simple in theory. Tight bomber formations would protect themselves with interlocking fire, creating a defensive shell of .50 caliber bullets that no enemy could penetrate. It was the American version of medieval warfare in the sky, flying castles bristling with guns. In practice, it was slaughter. During the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, 291 bombers launched without escort fighters. 60 were shot down. 600 men were killed. Another 138 aircraft were damaged beyond repair. The math was simple. For every 25 missions required to complete a tour, the odds of survival were nearly zero. Each plane carried 10 men. 10 hearts, 10 homes, 10 families betting their lives on a single philosophy: that the B-17 could defend itself. It couldn't. The B-17's armor was strong, its design resilient, its firepower immense, 13 machine guns mounted in nose, waist, dorsal, and tail positions. But it had one fatal weakness: the rear blind spot. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s learned to exploit it ruthlessly. They attacked from 6 o'clock low, climbing into the bomber's tail cone where its twin guns couldn't depress enough to fire effectively. The tail gunner, the man alone in the bubble, sat inside a plexiglass shell no larger than a refrigerator, surrounded by metal and wind. His field of view was narrow, his gun mount stiff, his aiming system primitive. A ring and bead sight, nothing more than 2 metal posts, against a closing speed of 500 meters. It was like throwing stones at a lightning bolt. Even in controlled training, tail gunners hit less than 12% of their targets. In combat, the average fell to under 8%. Many never fired a single effective burst before being killed. The Luftwaffe's tactics evolved around that weakness. They would swarm from behind, take minimal return fire, and deliver devastating 20mm cannon bursts into the bomber's tail and engines. The so-called Flying Fortress was bleeding to death from behind. In the cold, blue silence above Europe, survival came down to seconds. Chadwe, Kurtuan.Sahans. The time it took to spot an incoming fighter and fire before it reached lethal range. At 40 decrators, oxygen froze inside masks. Guns jammed. Vision blurred. Gunners learned to recognize death by sound. The pitch of approaching engines, the rattle of shell impacts, the dying moan of the airframe as it twisted in descent. For the tail gunner, it was the loneliest position in the sky. The rest of the crew looked forward toward the target. He looked backward, toward home, toward danger, toward every attack that came from behind. Some prayed, some smoked, some scribbled in notebooks between missions, and some, like the 22-year-old Staff Sergeant Michael Romano at Bassingbourn Airfield, began to think differently. Romano wasn't an engineer or a test pilot. He was a steelworker's son from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, small enough to fit in the tail compartment, smart enough to question why his guns rarely hit anything. After his 5th mission, over Frankfurt, his frustration boiled over. His bomber came back riddled with holes. His best friend's plane never returned. He'd fired over 600 rounds that day. Not a single hit. That night, he climbed into the empty bomber, flashlight in hand, and stared through the frozen plexiglass. His reflection stared back, distorted, ghost-like. And in that reflection, he saw something no engineer had noticed. The curved glass of the tail was already a mirror, and in it he could see angles of approach that his gun sight missed entirely. A simple thought struck him. If I can see what's behind me through a reflection, I can shoot before I'm seen. He began sketching in his flight log. Not equations, not blueprints, just geometry, sightlines, arcs. The problem wasn't his trigger or his aim. It was that he was fighting blind. He needed more eyes. The next night, Romano met Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, an older mechanic from Detroit, in the base sheet metal shop. Together, under dim light and the sound of distant takeoffs, they began cutting, welding, and shaping what would become one of the simplest and most effective P-21's field modifications of the entire air war. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't authorized. But it might just keep them alive. And by the time their first test flight left the runway, the mirror was fixed in place. A sliver of glass angled toward the unseen, waiting to change the outcome of every battle fought from the tail of a flying fortress. The invention was crude, fragile, and illegal. But soon, it would prove unstoppable. They worked after midnight in a corner of the maintenance hangar, the air smelling of solder, oil, and the faint tang of acetylene. Light from a single lamp tilted across the sheet metal bench. Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, a broad-shouldered mechanic from Detroit who'd learned to fix bridges in the Depression, handed Romano a protractor and a scrap of polished mirror pulled from a wrecked navigation dome. "Don't get a shot for this," Kellerman muttered, but his hands moved like a man who had never known how to stop making things work. Their plan was almost absurdly simple. Mount small convex mirrors at calculated angles to give the tail gunner peripheral vision of the area beneath and behind the stabilizer, and couple that feedback with a salvaged reflector sight from a written-off P-47. No power, no wiring, no engineering sign-off. Tadri feet, only geometry and courage. By dawn, the crude assembly was bolted to the gun yoke with a welded bracket Kellerman swore would hold at 300 milli. Not tracer. Safety wire and duct-taped shim stock secured the mirrors. They didn't record the modification in the log. Doing so would be a confession. Instead, they photographed components on a clipboard and slid the papers under the pile of sanctioned parts. Romano didn't tell his pilot. He did not want anyone to yank it before the next mission. His bomber launched for Münster with the device in place, the mirror catching the weak English light as if it were a small, dangerous star. high over the North Sea. The first test came not as a ceremony, but as chaos. Fighters always found the bombers. That was the nature of daylight raids. And two FW-190s slipped up from low 6 and rose like knives. Romano felt the signature of the approach in the air. A shift in engine note. A shadow sweeping under the stabilizer. He glanced at the mirrors. They showed him the approaching glint of metal before the fighter cleared the tail. He had maybe 2 seconds more than he would have without them. He centered the reflector's reticle, watched tracer paths reflect in the peripheral mirrors, made a tiny correction, and fired. For the first time in months of missions, Romano watched his tracers meet the aircraft. Smoke bloomed. The fighter fell away. The radio in the cockpit erupted with excited shouts, then dropped to a stunned quiet. Gun camera confirmed what Romano felt. A hit. The result was not magic. It was repeatable geometry. The mirror didn't aim for him. It gave him sight where none had been. It turned premature guessing into measured correction. Word travels fast in the mess tent. By the next week, a half-dozen tail gunners from the 91st crowded around the hard stand to inspect Romano's contraption. Some called it witchcraft. Others called it salvation. Maintenance crews were cautious at first. The brass would have a fit if they discovered unauthorized mods, but Kellerman quietly copied the brackets and cut more mirrors from damaged canopies. The device multiplied. Then came the problem every innovation in war eventually faces. Evidence. Captain Richard Voss. The squadron armament officer found out the hard way when routine post-flight checks turned up mirror mounts. Regulations were clear. Technical Order 0170, EG2, forbade unauthorized modifications to defensive armament. A sergeant in the tail who altered weapon systems was a disciplinary problem. Voss reported the modification up the chain. The response was predictably bureaucratic. Threats of court-martial, the language of manuals and testing protocols. But it was also, unexpectedly, pragmatic. Colonel Stanley Ray, commanding the 91st, listened to both sides. 17 bombers lost the prior week. 3 confirmed enemy aircraft downed. The numbers told him more than the regs did. "Prove it," Ray said. "You fly with it. We'll run gun cameras." So Romano flew. And the footage told its own story. Gun camera film from mirror-equipped aircraft showed earlier target acquisition, measurable leading corrections, and hits that would not have occurred with ring and bead sights alone. The math followed the eye. Tail gunners using the reflector system opened fire up to 2 seconds earlier, an eternity against a fighter closing at 400 or 500 miles per hour. Within days, the 91st authorized in-house fabrication. Kellerman's improvised production line cranked out 4 mirror assemblies a day. By October 20th, 18 B-17s carried the system. It spread to neighboring groups almost as fast as rumor passed along the flight line. Mechanics scavenged P-47 reflector sights, curved plexiglass, and scrap aluminum from crash-damaged airframes. Crews adapted angles to each turret's quirks. No 2 installations were identical, but all did the same thing: extend sight. Not every commander welcomed the change. Engineers fretted about vibration, stray glare, and structural integrity. Procurement officers worried about precedent. But the cold reality of mission losses and the clarity of gun camera evidence made dissent a practical matter more than a moral one. By November, higher echelons took notice. Reports reached 8th Air Force Operations Analysis. Units using auxiliary reflective aids showed significantly higher tail sector engagement success and lower immediate losses during certain raids. The data did not prove causation beyond question. Combat is messy. But it showed correlation strong enough to demand action. And so the mirror, illegal, improvised, and absurdly simple, became both a field-expedient weapon and a challenge to the military's slow machinery of change. It forced a decision that every commander dreads: follow doctrine to the letter and lose more men, or bend the rules to save lives. For Romano and the gunners who adopted the system, it was hardly theoretical. It was the difference between returning to a bar stool in Pittsburgh and not returning at all. The mirror had worked in a single turret. It had to survive sustained use, enemy scrutiny, and official inspection. If it could, it might alter tactics, design, and the very calculus of strategic bombing. In the air war over Europe, every crew position aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress carried danger, but none felt it more intimately than the man in the tail. He sat alone, 20 feet behind the rest of the crew, knees tucked beneath the twin barrels of his .50 caliber Brownings. The space was barely large enough for a child. Once inside, he couldn't even turn fully around. The noise was constant, 4 engines droning at full power, the guns rattling the fuselage like a living heartbeat. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen froze in hoses. When flak shells burst nearby, the tail gunners saw the explosions before anyone else and felt them last. Some lasted 5 missions. A few made it to 25. The official odds said none of them should. For gunners like Michael Romano, fear wasn't the problem. Futility was. They fought battles they rarely won, firing thousands of rounds that vanished into empty sky. The enemy came from behind, fast and invisible. The worst moment was never the attack itself, but the 2 silent seconds between sighting the enemy and realizing the guns couldn't reach him. Romano's mirror changed that feeling before it changed the numbers. For the first time, a tail gunner could see beneath his aircraft, track the shimmer of an enemy before the attack began. It wasn't technology that gave him courage. It was awareness, a belief that he could finally respond instead of wait. In that way, the mirror didn't just extend vision, it extended hope. The mirror's true power lay not in its materials, but in its timing. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, closing from 6 o'clock low, covered nearly 1,000 feet per second. The average human reaction time, even trained, was about half a second. That margin was enough to decide the outcome of every tail attack. Romano's reflective system gave gunners 2 additional seconds of visual warning. 2 seconds meant 2,000 feet more space to track, aim, and fire. That distance transformed defensive fire from desperation into control. Each mirror was angled to reflect a portion of the blind zone. One downward, one slightly offset to port, another aligned to catch tracer patterns in real time. Combined with the salvaged P-47 reflector sight, the system gave instantaneous feedback. A primitive analog of what modern pilots call a heads-up display. During post-mission reviews, analysts noted that gunners with the mirror sight were firing in shorter, more deliberate bursts, an indication of earlier target acquisition. On the October 20th raid to Durham, these aircraft reported an engagement rate nearly 3 times higher than control squadrons using standard sights. The change rippled outward. Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to attacking in tight formations now found themselves under accurate fire earlier than expected. Their approach timings collapsed. Coordinated waves broke apart under unanticipated bursts of defensive fire. One captured German pilot later told interrogators, "The tail guns now open fire before I can see the whites of the glass. They must have a new instrument." He wasn't wrong. The B-17's defensive network was a masterpiece of design for its time, but it was designed for 1940, not the fast, high-angle combat of 1943. The aircraft's original ring and bead sights belonged to a slower era, closer to the Great War than to jet age. Factory engineers proposed fixes. Powered turrets, improved optics, but these required months of testing and transatlantic shipment. On the front lines, Men like Kellerman and Romano didn't have months. They had the next mission. Their solution reflected the best kind of wartime innovation: field engineering under fire. No laboratories, no blueprints, just mechanics who understood that survival sometimes meant breaking the rule book. By late autumn, mechanics across the 91st, 94th, and 351st bomb groups were building variants of Romano's system. Some used polished aluminum in place of mirrors. Others used small glass panels cut from damaged canopies. Even the crude versions worked. Reports from ordnance officers began to list auxiliary reflective aids as non-standard but effective. The language was careful. Bureaucrats hated to admit that an unapproved idea had succeeded. Yet the pattern was undeniable. In one internal 8th Air Force memorandum dated November 1943, analysts noted crew-devised optical devices show measurable improvement in aft sector engagement and survivability. It was the closest thing to a confession the bureaucracy would ever make. For the crews, the mirror became something more than hardware. It became a symbol, proof that their fate wasn't entirely in the hands of distant engineers or headquarters memos. Tail gunners began to personalize their mirrors, polishing them before flight, etching small marks or initials along the frame. Some called them guardian eyes. Others simply called them Romano glass. In debriefs, pilots noticed a change in their crews. Confidence rose. Fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into focus. Gunners began calling out enemy approaches sooner, their voices steadier. They trusted what they could see, and what they could see was finally enough to matter. Psychologists later studying combat stress among bomber crews pointed to this kind of situational control as a key factor in survival. The difference between panic and performance was often a tool, any tool, that restored a sense of agency. Romano's mirror did exactly that. For the engineers, it was an unsanctioned violation of procedure. For the men in the sky, it was a glimpse of light in a frozen, spinning world of noise and death. Each angle, Daharit, human, tactical, technological, psychologically, converged into one truth. The mirror was not merely an accessory. It was evolution born from necessity. And it worked because the men who built it refused to wait for permission to survive. The next test would decide whether this field innovation could stand up to full-scale combat. Danitin id siin sector, and whether headquarters would finally acknowledge the impossible. Innovation in war always begins the same way. Kritapan. One soldier breaks the rules, and another officer has to decide whether to punish or protect him. For the 8th Air Force, that decision came to rest on the desk of Colonel Stanley Ray, commander of the 91st Bomb Group. When news of Romano's unauthorized modification reached him in October 1943, he convened a heated meeting of engineers, ordnance officers, and flight commanders in a cold Nissen hut at Bassingbourn Airfield. On one side stood the regulations, Technical Order 0122 EG2, a set of rules that explicitly prohibited changes to defensive armament without factory authorization. On the other stood statistics, brutal, undeniable, and written in blood. 17 bombers lost in a single week. 3 enemy fighters destroyed in the same period. Major William Calhoun, operations officer, argued with quiet fury. "Sir, this kid shot down a 109 with a sight you called impossible. If breaking rules keeps our crews alive, maybe the rule's the problem." Captain Morrison, the engineering officer, countered, "One success does not validate an untested device. This could cause glare, structural fatigue, or even reflection hazards." Colonel Ray listened in silence, eyes on the casualty chart tacked to the wall. When he finally spoke, It was not with hesitation, but exhaustion. 17 bombers, 680 men. You tell me which hazard is worse. Romano was ordered to keep his mirror system installed and fly 3 additional missions with gun cameras recording every engagement. If results improved measurably, the entire group would adopt it. If not, the mirror would be removed and Romano would face formal discipline. It was an extraordinary compromise. Half defiance, half hope. And it marked the moment the Air Force unofficially sanctioned the first bottom-up innovation of the bomber war. When the tests worked, everything changed. Under Colonel Ray's quiet approval, Technical Sergeant Kellerman and his maintenance crew turned a corner of the hangar into a makeshift production line. They scavenged mirrors from wrecked aircraft, reflector sights from grounded P-47 Thunderbolts, and aluminum brackets from scrap piles. The process was crude but efficient. Each installation took about 6 hours, mostly done by hand. By October 20, 1943, 18 bombers in the 91st carried the mirror-augmented reflector sight. Their first large-scale mission, Rewrote, a strike against Duran, provided proof on an industrial scale. Gun camera footage showed a 23% hit rate, nearly triple the existing average. In debriefs, crews reported earlier warning calls and more controlled bursts. The results reached higher headquarters within days. At High Wycombe, the nerve center of the 8th Air Force, analysts under Brigadier General Frederick Castle reviewed the footage. The findings were impossible to ignore. Bomber formations equipped with the mirror system suffered markedly fewer rear attacks and recorded more confirmed kills per 1,000 rounds fired. General Castle flew to Bassingbourn. Unannounced on November 18th, he walked the flight line, inspected the tail section of a modified B-17, and spoke briefly with Romano. "Sergeant," he asked, examining the angled glass, "how did you know this would work?" Romano shrugged. "I didn't, sir. But I knew what didn't." Castle smiled, a weary grin that came only from men who had seen too many casualty reports. He turned to his aides and said, "Authorize it. Every aircraft in the 4th Bomb Wing will have one of these within 30 days. With that, the mirror officially entered the war. By winter 1943, Luftwaffe pilots began to notice something strange. Attacks that once went unopposed were now met with precise, defensive fire long before the expected engagement range. Fighter leaders compiled reports noting that American bombers opened fire prematurely and exhibited improved aim. One veteran ace, Major Hans Joachim Jabs, recorded in his diary, "The flying fortresses have become more dangerous. Their tail gunners now shoot with precision previously seen only in power turrets. Attacks from the rear quadrant now carry unacceptable risk." That shift changed the air war's geometry. German pilots started avoiding the classic 6 o'clock attack profile, switching instead to head-on or oblique approaches. These demanded higher skill and exposed them to nose and top turret fire. More dangerous positions for the attacker. In essence, a mirror the size of a postcard had rewritten Luftwaffe tactics. By January 1944, captured German documents showed explicit warnings. Approach from rear sector no longer advisable. Allied bombers have improved rear sighting devices. Those improved devices were Kellerman's hand-built assemblies, the unapproved creations of mechanics who didn't wait for permission to survive. Every innovation in war has its symbol. The Norden bomb sight represented precision. The P-51 Mustang represented range. The mirror represented something smaller, but infinitely more human. Ingenuity, born from fear. In every crew hut, among oil-stained flight jackets and worn logbooks, that mirror became a talisman. It wasn't mass-produced. It wasn't elegant. But it worked, and that made it sacred. Romano's device proved that survival could come from the bottom of the hierarchy. It reminded the engineers and generals that the men in the machines often understood their flaws better than those who designed them. When the first mirror-equipped bombers returned from missions without loss, crews didn't cheer. They just nodded quietly, cleaning their guns and polishing the glass that had given them a glimpse of life in a sky of death. The lesson spread beyond the airfields of England. Field innovation became policy, at least unofficially. Mechanics were encouraged to modify equipment within reason. The Air Force began to realize that flexibility was not disorder. It was evolution. The mirror had done more than improve gunnery. It had cracked open the door to a new kind of warfare, one where ideas, not orders, kept men alive. By the start of 1944, mirror systems had spread across multiple bomb groups, and formal engineering teams at Boeing's Cheyenne Modification Center were quietly integrating the concept into new turret designs. But before that industrial adoption came, one more test awaited, the ultimate proof that the device could stand the fury of full-scale combat and change the course of survival itself. December 20th, 1943. The pre-dawn air over England carries a hard frost, the kind that clings to flight suits and steel. At Bassingbourn Airfield, crews gather in silence, eyes fixed on the mission board. The target, Bremen, the German industrial city that has already cost the 8th Air Force more aircraft than anyone dares to count. Inside the briefing hut, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the scratch of pencils marking routes on maps. When the curtain pulls back to reveal the red string stretching deep into northern Germany, a low murmur ripples through the room. For the men of the 91st Bomb Group, the mission means one thing: another dance with death. But this time, a small fraction of those aircraft carry something new: Romano's mirror-equipped sighting system. 18 bombers, each with a sliver of angled glass mounted behind the twin Brownings, form up at the edge of the formation. They are the quiet experiment, the gamble no one in authority will officially acknowledge. At 7:40 hours, the engines ignite. 4 per aircraft, 800 across the entire strike force. The earth shakes under the combined roar. Pilots ease throttles forward. The formation lifts into the gray. Romano's aircraft, Knockout Dropper, joins the middle flight. In the tail compartment, he runs his gloved fingers over the mirror mount, ensuring it hasn't loosened. Frost clings to the bolts. The glass catches the dim light like a blade. At 20,000 feet, the formation disappears into cloud. Oxygen masks hiss. Inside the radio compartment, voices crackle. Bandits assembling near Osnabrück. Estimated 30 to 40 fighters. They always know. The Germans always know. By 11-12 hours, the bombers cross into German airspace. Flak bursts blossom around them, black flowers blooming in silence before shattering the world with concussion. The formation holds. Then the fighters come. From the south and below, a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s and Bf 109s rise through the haze, cutting upward at impossible angles. To the men inside the bombers, they look like silver darts streaking through smoke. For the first time, the mirror-equipped tails are ready. Romano watches his mirror. Adwanani Tutier Twitu. 3 small reflections overlapping like a triptych of death. A glint of sunlight flares beneath the tailplane. An approaching fighter, 6 o'clock, low. His thumb finds the triggers. Through the reflector reticle, the image floats steady, red against gray. In the mirror, tracer lines reflect back at him, confirming his aim. He adjusts by inches. Fires. The first burst misses. The second connects. A thin trail of black smoke arcs through the reflection, widening, twisting. The German fighter peels away, trailing flame. Across the formation, other gunners report similar results. Fighters that once slipped unseen beneath the bombers now meet measured, preemptive fire. The once silent 6 o'clock blind spot is alive with tracers. German coordination falters. Their radio frequencies, later intercepted, capture frustration. Americans fire too early. Impossible to close distance. The effect is contagious. Tail gunners, emboldened by their improved vision, call out enemy movements faster. Top turrets pivot sooner. Waist gunners open covering fire earlier. The formation's rear defense, once its Achilles heel, now burns with organized fury. The mission lasts 4 hours. In that time, mirror-equipped aircraft record 2 confirmed kills and 6 probables, a figure unheard of for such a small subset of the group. Bombing accuracy holds steady. Defensive losses drop sharply. The 91st returns with only 3 aircraft lost, half the usual attrition rate for a target as deadly as Bremen. The statistical outlier becomes an argument, a gleaming, undeniable fact in a war built on blood and math. When Knockout Dropper lands, its landing gear groaning under the weight of 127 flak holes, ground crews swarm it. In the tail, the mirror mount is cracked, the glass peppered with tiny shards. But intact, Romano removes it himself, wraps it in a cloth, and tucks it into his flight bag. That night, gun camera film rolls across a projector in a dim operations hut. Colonel Ray, Major Calhoun, and Captain Morrison watch in silence as the footage plays. Tracer arcs, mirrored reflections, a German fighter exploding mid-frame. When the film ends, no one speaks for a moment. Then Morrison, the same engineer who had argued for regulation over innovation, exhales. "It works," he says. "God help me, it actually works." Analysts calculate afterward, a standard B-17 tail gunner fired an average of 2,800 rounds per confirmed kill. Romano's footage shows 190 rounds per kill. Chathirit, a 14-fold improvement. These were not theoretical gains. They were men who came home. Reports compiled by the 8th Air Force's Operations Analysis Section quietly noted, field-devised auxiliary optical devices significantly improved defensive efficiency and crew survivability. But officially, the mirror remained nameless, a ghost innovation that could not exist on paper, only in results. The Bremen raid was not the war's largest or deadliest mission, but it marked the moment the mirror crossed from rumor to recognition. Command could no longer ignore it. The evidence and the survival rates spoke for themselves. From this day forward, the question would not be whether the mirror worked. It would be how fast they could get it onto every fortress in the sky. The morning after the Bremen mission, the results reached headquarters at High Wycombe, where air combat analysts pored over endless reels of gun camera film. Normally, these reviews were grim, blurry footage of chaos, tracers vanishing into cloud, and aircraft disintegrating mid-frame. This time, the pattern was different. Fighters appeared in the tail mirrors long before they entered firing range. Defensive fire was steadier, less frantic, and most importantly, Luftwaffe pilots were breaking off their attacks early. Data from the 91st Bomb Group showed something no one had seen in months: a net positive exchange rate in tail engagements. For every bomber lost, 2 enemy fighters were downed or damaged beyond recovery. For General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Bomb Wing, this was more than an anomaly. More than treat seats, it was salvation. He arrived at Bassingbourn Airfield on November 18, 1943, unannounced and unguarded, his jeep rolling to a stop beside the mirror-equipped knockout dropper. He climbed the ladder into the tail section, knelt, and ran a gloved finger along the welded bracket. "Sergeant," he asked Romano, who stood nearby, "how'd you know this would work?" Romano, exhausted from the mission, simply said, "I didn't, sir." "But I knew what didn't," Castle straightened. studied the mirror's angle against the light, and smiled. "Then we'd better start building more of them." With those words, the innovation that began as an illegal modification became a quietly approved field order. Colonel Ray authorized the creation of a dedicated workshop on base. Kellerman's small corner bench became a full-fledged field. Manufacturing line, mirror. Assemblies were built from whatever materials the crews could scavenge. Navigation mirrors from wrecked B-24s, reflector sights from disabled P-47s, and aluminum mounts cut from crashed aircraft skin. Each was tested in flight before installation. Production rose to 4 complete assemblies per day. Within 2 weeks, nearly 20 bombers in the 91st carried the modification. By early December, the system had spread to neighboring bomb groups. and the 94th, 303rd, and 351st, through informal exchanges of drawings and notes. No official blueprints existed. The plans passed from one crew to another like contraband. A gunner would land, step into a mess tent, and pull out a folded sketch on ration paper. Mirror angles, mounting brackets, sightline distances. Within hours, another plane had the system installed. This was not engineering. It was survival through replication. Innovation never travels alone. It drags bureaucracy behind it. As the mirror spread, word reached 8th Air Force Armament Engineering Division, and the reaction was as predictable as it was cold. Captain Theodore Morrison, who had once opposed Romano's design, received a formal inquiry demanding explanation for the unverified reflective apparatuses observed on multiple B-17 tail positions. The memo cited potential issues: structural stress on the gun mount, glare interference with targeting, non-standard optics affecting calibration. But for every concern, the numbers offered rebuttal. Loss rates for mirror-equipped aircraft had fallen by over 30% within a month. Gunners were firing less, but hitting more. Colonel Ray replied with a one-sentence telegram: "Recommend retention. Operational results confirm efficacy." No further argument came. The mirror had won its trial by data. By December 1943, Brigadier General Castle authorized the modification across the entire 4th Bomb Wing. It became known, unofficially, as the Field Expedient Tailgun Aiming System. Type I engineering units at the Cheyenne Modification Center in Wyoming received detailed reports from England. Within weeks, they incorporated the concept into the design of the B-17G Cheyenne tail turret, featuring a factory-installed N8 reflector sight. Positioned almost exactly where Romano's salvaged P-47 sight had been. In less than 2 months, a piece of scavenged glass and aluminum wire had evolved into a standardized production feature. Back in Europe, the change was immediate. Luftwaffe fighter pilots adapted again, abandoning the 6 o'clock low approach entirely by early 1944. Attacks shifted to the 12 o'clock high and oblique angles, forcing German pilots into more dangerous head-on passes. The mirror had altered not just tactics, but psychology. Where once bombers had flown as prey, they now fought as predators of their own. Defense, January 1944, brought the confirmation. No statistician could deny tail gunner. Hit rates across the 8th Air Force rose from 8% to over 20%, depending on formation and visibility. Loss rates on missions flown by modified groups dropped from 1 in 5 to 1 in 10. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about morale. Crews who had once flown with fatal resignation now climbed into their aircraft, believing they might actually make it home. The mirror didn't make the flying fortress invincible, but it gave the men inside it a fighting chance. Something they hadn't felt in months. Romano continued flying missions through early 1944. logging kill after kill with his improvised sight. But innovation often exacts its own price. On February 22nd, during the massive operation later known as Big Week, his aircraft took heavy flak damage over Leipzig. With hydraulics failing and the tail section shredded, Romano kept firing, protecting the formation until the bomber limped into Allied-held Belgium for an emergency landing. He and his crew survived. His mirror, cracked and blackened, was later found among the wreckage. For his actions and the contribution of his design, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation praised his extraordinary achievement in aerial combat, but omitted the one thing that truly defined it: the invention that had started as a rule violation. The mirror had done its work. From a single midnight sketch to hundreds of modified bombers, it had changed not only the air war's mechanics, but its mindset, and as 1944 began, the impact of that reflection. Quiet, uncredited, yet undeniable. Invention was about to reshape the entire course of bomber defense in Europe. By January 1944, the 8th Air Force was no longer bleeding helplessly over Germany. The shift was subtle at first: one more returning bomber, one less folded flag. But to the men who tracked the numbers, it was unmistakable. Tail gunner accuracy across the 8th had nearly tripled since autumn. The once deadly 6 o'clock low attack profile had become suicidal for the Luftwaffe. Enemy pilots reported that the fortresses now shoot before we appear, their carefully timed climbs shattered by bursts of defensive fire that seemed almost prescient. On paper, it was progress through statistics. In truth, it was the quiet triumph of a mirror. Within weeks of the Bremen success, unofficial modification orders spread like wildfire. Each bomb group adapted its own method. The 91st used Kellerman's aluminum brackets. The 94th scavenged cockpit mirrors from P-47s, while the 100th field-tested dual mirror assemblies that gave gunners overlapping views of high and low angles. None were identical. All worked. By February, analysts at High Wycombe were tracking a new constant. Mirror-equipped aircraft were returning from missions with an average loss rate of 9%, compared to the 15–18% endured by unmodified formations. The difference was not only measurable, it was life-saving. Luftwaffe intelligence soon confirmed the shift. Intercepted German radio messages referenced improved American tail vision and reflective devices under the turret. Major Johannes Steinhoff, a respected German ace, would later write in his memoir, "The fortresses grew eyes. Their tail fire reached us before we were ready. The mirror, or whatever it was, stole our advantage." German units adapted by abandoning low rear attacks in favor of frontal and oblique passes, forcing them into tighter firing windows and heavier flak exposure. The American formations, once predictable victims, became unpredictable opponents. For the first time since the daylight bombing campaign began, the air war's geometry favored the defenders. Military historians often measure victory in missions completed or tonnage dropped. But for bomber crews, the only number that mattered was how many men came back. Between October 1943 and March 1944, total bomber losses dropped by more than one-third across the 8th Air Force. Part of this was due to better escort coverage from P-51 Mustangs, but the other half, the quiet half, came from field modifications like Romano's mirror. In debriefs, tail gunners described the same phenomenon in identical words. "We see them sooner." Some estimated that the mirror gave them 2 seconds of extra time. Others said 3. The difference sounds small, but at 400 miles per hour, that meant life. Operations analysis later calculated that even a 1-second improvement in response time reduced bomber losses by 12%. Romano's system gave them triple that. For every mirror installed, Statistics suggested one less crew lost within a month. Despite the overwhelming results, there were no medals for innovation. Headquarters issued no official commendations for Romano, Kellerman, or the maintenance crews who produced hundreds of unregistered mirror mounts. The only acknowledgement came in the form of a single document. Chartifix Q, an internal Air Force memo dated January 26, 1944. Field expedient reflective systems have contributed to significant improvements in rear sector defense. Standardization recommended where practical. That was military language for revolution. Factories began incorporating periscopic features and reflector sights into production models. At Boeing's Cheyenne Modification Center, engineers redesigned the tail of the B-17G into what became known as the Cheyenne turret. Retreatain Setsetinitu, a streamlined housing with expanded downward visibility and a fixed reflector gun sight modeled directly on Romano's concept. What had started as a scrap metal experiment in a frozen hangar now appeared on factory schematics across the United States. But perhaps the most profound transformation wasn't mechanical at all. It was emotional. Bomber command doctors had long noted anticipatory fatigue among tail gunners, men growing desensitized or detached from constant threat. After the mirror's introduction, reports of combat stress symptoms declined. Crews began to talk less about dying and more about beating them to the shot. It wasn't confidence in armor or firepower, it was faith in a tiny piece of glass. Romano's mirror gave these men what even generals couldn't, a tangible sense of control. They polished the glass before takeoff, checked its angle like a ritual, and trusted it like a partner. It wasn't just a tool, it was proof that someone in their ranks, one of them, had outsmarted death, even briefly. As winter turned to spring and the bombers pushed deeper into the Reich, the mirror's legend grew. Crews told new recruits about it during training, passing along sketches and measurements like family secrets. And while the engineers back home refined it into polished metal and factory precision, the men who first built it knew what it really was, a reflection of willpower, improvised under fire. The mirror had changed the air war, Ausamadiadin Dantate Antoine Tider, but its story, like so many wartime miracles, was already being buried under newer machines and official language. Soon, as technology advanced and escorts filled the skies, it would fade from headlines and reports, but its shadow, its reflection, would remain in every improved sighting system that followed. By the spring of 1945, the Flying Fortress was no longer the centerpiece of Allied air power. The skies over Europe had changed. Long-range P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts escorted bomber formations deep into Germany, cutting the Luftwaffe's reach to shreds. Flak, once the deadliest threat, was now the only predator left. The B-17, once bleeding over every mission, became a symbol of survival, of engineering evolution shaped by the people inside it. Among the upgrades listed in post-war documentation were major structural changes: power turrets, heated suits, radar navigation. Buried among them, without citation or name, was a small line: improved field of rear visual acquisition, Aninterdiderit Sahaishoditan, integrated reflector sight, tail. That single sentence was the bureaucratic gravestone of the mirror. It had done its work. The Air Force had absorbed it, renamed it, industrialized it, and erased the men who made it. When the war ended, Staff Sergeant Michael Romano returned to Pennsylvania with a medal on his chest and the same quiet hands that had once built something extraordinary. He married, worked in a machine shop, raised 2 sons. To his family, he spoke little of his service, only that it was cold up there. The mirror cracked and smoke-stained from its final flight. Chatutuatidu sat wrapped in cloth in a drawer beside his discharge papers. In the years that followed, the Air Force moved on. Jet bombers replaced propellers. Radar replaced mirrors. The B-29 Superfortress introduced periscopic and remote-controlled gun sights, direct descendants of Romano's field invention. Later, the B-36 and B-52 carried sensor suites whose targeting systems could trace their lineage to that first experiment in a cold English hangar. Yet his name never appeared in the technical history books, not because he wasn't known, but because the Air Force of the post-war world no longer had room for improvisation in its myth. When Romano died in 1983, his obituary mentioned his wartime service, but not his invention. History had, for a time, forgotten the mirror entirely. In the 1970s, a retired ordnance officer named David Haskell began compiling accounts from surviving B-17 crews for a small aviation history journal. In one interview, a veteran gunner from the 94th mentioned a mirror setup some kid made that saved our tails in '43. That offhand remark started a paper trail. Haskell dug through declassified mission reports, gun camera analyses, and field memos. He found a pattern of references to auxiliary reflective devices appearing in late 1943, always tied to the same bomb groups, always before official reflector sights reached production. He found one photograph, grainy, black and white, showing a gloved hand adjusting a small mirror bolted beneath a B-17 tailgun mount. The caption read simply, 91st Bomb Group, Bassingbourn, 1943, Crew Modified Sighting System. It was the first visual proof that the mirror had existed. In 1988, Haskell published Eyes in the Rear, the forgotten innovation of the B-17 mirror gun sight. It reached a small but passionate audience of historians and veterans. Among those readers was Romano's son, who recognized his father's name buried in a footnote. He donated the original mirror, still wrapped in its oil-stained cloth, to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force at Dayton, Ohio. Today, that same mirror sits quietly inside the tail section of a restored B-17 display. The placard reads, Field Modification, Reflective Gun Sight, 1943, donated by the family of Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, 91st Bomb Group. No grand ceremony marked its installation, but the reflection it catches under the museum lights is the same reflection that once glinted in the frozen sky above Bremen. Sativor Fiu, the reflection that helped men live. Romano's mirror outlived him in form, if not in name. Every rearward-looking periscope, every radar warning display, every cockpit mirror owes a distant debt to that first field modification. What began as a desperate idea became doctrine. See first, shoot first, survive. Its principle remains at the heart of every aircraft defense system to this day. Sutanayant from bomber turrets to fighter jets equipped with 360 situational awareness displays. The mirror's logic was timeless. Knowledge is armor. In the end, the war erased many names, but not the truth they left behind. Some innovations roar in history books. Others, like Romano's, whisper through time, not in sound, but in reflection. And in that reflection, one can still glimpse a young gunner, frozen in a plexiglass dome over Germany, watching death approach and choosing, with nothing but a mirror and his will, to fight it. Every war leaves behind two kinds of inventions. The loud ones and the quiet ones. The loud ones roar in headlines. Jet engines, atomic fire, radar sweeping the night sky. They are monuments to nations. The quiet ones are born in the dark, in hangars, trenches, and frozen turrets. They belonged to men who simply wanted to see another sunrise. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano's mirror was one of the quiet ones. It didn't make history by name. It made it by consequence. A sliver of glass and aluminum, angled just right, had given humanity something extraordinary: the ability to see what was coming. That principle, awareness as armor, would ripple through every design that followed, from the periscopic sights of the B-29 Superfortress to the radar tails of the B-52, and even the digital displays inside today's stealth bombers, chassis, each carried the same reflection of survival. But Romano's story wasn't about machines. It was about the mind inside them. A young man, frozen in a plexiglass cage over Germany, dared to challenge the idea that death was inevitable. In doing so, he proved that innovation doesn't begin in laboratories. It begins in fear, in desperation, in the stubborn belief that even a mirror can change fate. When we look at that fragment of glass today, resting behind museum glass, it's easy to see it as an artifact. But in truth, it's a reflection of us, of what human beings do when cornered by the impossible. We adapt. We imagine. We fight to see a little farther into the dark. Somewhere above Europe, in the frozen echoes of 1943, that mirror still glints in the sunlight. B-29, a silent testament to courage, curiosity, and the smallest invention that helped win the greatest war. Because sometimes, the difference between life and death is just a second's reflection.